So welcome everybody to the weekly Wednesday workshop. I'm Felicia Bell from the Gulf States Regional Office located in Jackson, Mississippi. We assist farmers in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and Florida. So if you have any members, network members, family, or anyone that need assistance with sustainable agriculture and sustainable energy, please let our office know. We definitely can assist you. So today we have a great speaker, one of my co-workers, and I'm so glad to be able to share his expertise with you today. The topic today is perennial forages and trees for livestock, and you will be hearing from Justin Morris. He's the regenerative grazing specialist for NCAT. Justin, I'll turn it over to you at this time.
Okay, thank you, Felicia, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here with all of you, wherever you're joining from around the nation. I'm going to share my screen here and hope for the best that the technology will work in our favor. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time kind of taking a journey down the plants that animals are utilizing in our landscapes. And because the United States is such a diverse country with diverse climate and soils, this is not going to be an all-in-one comprehensive on every single kind of palatable grass or forb or tree that's out there. But I'm going to try to hit a few highlights as we're going through here, kind of highlighting some plants that we're going to find kind of down the southeast part of the country, as well as plants that would be found in other areas of the country as well. So the mainstay of livestock's diets is going to be coming from grasses. It's going to be coming from forbs. For those of you who may not be familiar with that term, forb, essentially what we're talking about are plants that are broadleaves, so a non-grass type plant. And then we're also going to be talking a little bit about some of the larger plant species, getting into specifically trees that we may be able to utilize in our landscapes. And those trees can also provide fodder for livestock. So I kind of wanted to start off here a little bit with a little bit of 101, some basics on plants. So we're going to, in this first part, we're going to kind of cover some of the broad categories that we'll find amongst plants. We'll discuss what the differences are between annual, biennial, and perennial plants. Then we'll get into cool seasons versus warm season plants. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between grasses and broadleaves, bunch grasses and sod-forming grasses, and then native and introduced plants. And then after this, we'll have a little bit of discussion about the integration of utilizing trees in our pasture landscapes, whether we have established woodland already, or if we're considering actually integrating trees into an already open pasture. So when we talk about plants, one of the easiest categories to start off with is talking about the difference between annuals and perennials. So with annual plants, we're really looking at plants that can go from germination all the way through seed development in a 1-year time period. And these plants really, they prioritize seed production and above ground growth over root biomass production. So most of our annual plants can grow a tremendous amount of biomass above ground. I mean, if you just look at corn, for instance, corn is an annual plant. It's incredible the amount of tonnage that those plants can actually accumulate above ground. And next time you're in the grocery store and you go to the produce aisle, and indeed in most of the food in the center aisles of the grocery store, when you look at where most of our staple food crops come from, most of them come from annual plants. So we're looking at things like, corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, and then most of our vegetable crops that you find in the produce aisle are also annuals. Additionally, if you were to pick up a cover crop seed catalog, or go online and look up different cover crop species that may be adaptable to your area, most of those cover crops are going to be annual plants. And that's because of the cropping system. We only want the cover crop there for, anywhere from, 150 days or thereabouts, or 200 days long. And so we don't want to invest the expense in perennial seed to put something there that's just going to be taken out with the next year's growing cash crop. The other thing too, and it's kind of important to know, is that whenever soil's disturbed, often the first plants to arrive on the scene to revegetate that area are going to be annual plants. And you can kind of think of annual plants really as those first responders. They're kind of like the ambulance. So as those first responders, what those annuals do is they are the first part in what we call ecological succession. And ecological succession just means how the plant community changes over time as one plant community starts replacing another. And so nature has this fantastic system built in that when soil gets disturbed, annual plants are generally the first ones to arrive on the scene. And the reason why that is because, as we've already talked about, annual plants can produce a lot of above ground biomass. So they can actually cover the land, cover that bare soil very quickly, because nature doesn't like bare soil. Perennial plants, which we'll get to in a moment, generally take longer to cover the ground. Annual plants are usually very fast germinating. They're quick to get out of the ground. And if you look at it with most of our crops that we grow, since most of those are annuals, corn, for instance, it may only be in the ground for 110, 120 days. And so it's able to go from germination all the way through seed development in a fairly quick period of time. So here are some other examples. I'll show you pictures here as we're going along. We've talked a little bit, we've shown, like wheat and oats. Corn is also an annual plant. It's the most broadly planted annual plant that we have in the U.S. But there's some other plants out there that we'll find in our pasture ecosystems. So some of those would include plants like arrowleaf clover and crimson clover. Crimson clover, you can actually find them in cover crop seed catalogs. Subterranean clover and bermuda clover. Now, most of these clovers that I just mentioned to you, I'm not going to see all that much here where I'm at in Southeast Idaho. So those of you who are down in the Gulf States region, these are plants that are likely to be somewhat familiar to you, or you're going to want to get to know more about them in the future. Now, when we move out of annual plants, then we get into what we call biennials. And biennials are really plants that have a 2-year growth cycle. So the plant germinates in year 1, usually goes through, a intermediate phase by the end of year 1, and then it picks that back up in year 2, all the way through seed production by the end of year 2. And as far as biennial plants in a pasture or grazing situation, red clover is by far the most prevalent biennial that exists out there. Now, the other thing too is that a number of our noxious weeds are also biennials. So if you were to look at many of our thistles, a lot of our thistles are biennials, so they'll usually go from germination to what's called a rosette stage, where it's still very prostrate, very low to the ground. But then in year 2, it'll actually develop a stalk or a stem. And then it'll develop seed production in year 2. So a lot of our noxious weeds oftentimes are biennials. Another noxious weed that I can think of right now that we have up here is a plant called hound's tongue. That's a plant that if you just happen to just walk by it, the seed pods are like Velcro. And so they'll attach onto your shoelaces, your pants, your socks. I've spent a lot of time when I first came around hound's tongue. I now know a little bit better. I can spot the hound's tongue a lot sooner, so I don't have to take all the time of picking all that stuff off my clothing. But again, that's another biennial plant that has a 2-year growth cycle to it. Now we get into what I would call really the lodestars of forage production. And these are perennials. So when you're driving down the road, if whatever tree you're looking at, or if you're looking at a pastoral landscape, or especially a native landscape, pretty much everything that your eyes are hitting, unless it's something like annual ryegrass that's been planted, for forage, or one of the cereal crops that's been planted for forage, by and large, most of the plants that you're going to be seeing are perennial. So when you look out in nature, nature, when you look at the number of plants that are perennial versus those that are annual, it's like 99% of the plants in the world are perennial. A very small percentage comparatively are annual. Now, the thing is with perennials is we're usually looking at a lifespan of at least 3 years, and that could go to decades long if the plant is able to maintain in a very healthy condition. Now, the thing about perennials is that perennials are kind of the opposite of an annual. And it's not just about lifespan only, but it's about how they allocate their resources. So previously we talked about how annuals prioritize above ground growth and seed production, and they don't prioritize root production as much. And perennials are the complete opposite. So they will prioritize root biomass production, but they will not prioritize above ground production as much. So you could say that an annual plant is kind of top heavy, so produces a lot of biomass up top, but when you weigh the mass of the roots, it's fairly small. Whereas a perennial plant is built upside down, so they're bottom heavy. So you may have, for instance, for example, 2 ton per acre of tall fescue above ground, but your root biomass may be at least equal to that, if not greater than what you see above ground. The other thing too is perennials primarily reproduce through their roots. So they will either send a root just under the soil surface, and that root is also known as a rhizome, and then that root will come out and then generate a pop-up, a new tiller there for a new plant to grow. Or if you're looking at plants like some of your clovers, like your white clover, they will actually use runners just on the soil surface, and then which are cold stolons, and then they will actually help to germinate that clover can spread. So those plants primarily are reproducing through the root system, but they also produce seed. So as you can see here in this picture of tall fescue, it obviously produces seed, but it's not putting as much emphasis or as much priority into seed production as it does into below ground root biomass. So some perennials that some of you who live in the South are no doubtedly very familiar with are plants like Bermuda grass and and also bahia grass. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but all those from down the south can be laughing at me when I mispronounce words compared to how they're supposed to be pronounced down there. So these are two plants that, you know, can live a very long time. Both these plants are actually introduced from Africa. So they were, you know, these are not native plants to the US, but they were brought in from the African subcontinent. Orchard grass. Now that's actually grass that we have up here in Idaho on irrigated pastures. And that's a very, very high quality grass that's used in both pasture and hay systems. Big blue stem. I never saw a big blue stem plant until I journeyed to Nebraska and saw my very first big blue stem plant. And I couldn't believe how tall it was. It was taller than me, and I'm just over 6 feet tall. And I hadn't realized up until that point how tall grass could get. But big blue stem is a native warm season grass, and it grows everywhere. Grows very well, you know, in eastern Nebraska, and then further south and further east. And it's a plant of the tall grass prairie. Indian grass is also another native warm season grass that oftentimes can be in companion with big blue stem. A lot of times when people do warm season grass plantings, they'll usually oftentimes include Indian grass with big blue stem, with Cytox grama. And then here, as you look at this plant here on the right, Eastern gamma grass. Now, this is a reason why if I ever wanted to be able to bring a plant from down south and it would be able to grow reliably here without a bunch of irrigation, this is the plant that I would definitely be looking for, is Eastern gamma grass. So for those of you who are not familiar with Eastern gamma grass in the world of grasses is known as the ice cream of grass. And that's because of its super high palatability and its high energy content. And what's kind of interesting about it is that it's actually a relative of corn. And as you can imagine, since it is a relative of corn, it can get quite big. So individual clumps of Eastern gamma grass can be 4 feet in diameter, and the seed heads can be positioned as high as 9 feet. So that makes for one monstrous plant. Now, because of that large stature, it has been, producers have observed that under good growing conditions and with the right management, that Eastern gamma grass can actually yield up to 7 tons per acre. And that's, to me, that's a mind-blowing amount of forage that can be grown from a native warm season grass that doesn't require a ton of fertility to be thrown at it in order to produce a quite large amount of forage. So the other thing about Eastern gamma grass that you should know is that it does begin growing earlier in the spring than most other native grasses, such as big blue stem and switchgrass. So switchgrass here on the left, also another tall grass, is also a native warm season plant. That is oftentimes planted in amongst other native warm season plants if someone is going to be doing an all native seeding on their pastures. So switchgrass is a good one to be able to include with that. Meadow fescue is a different type of grass than tall fescue is. Meadow fescue is oftentimes grown up in the north central part of the United States. So if you get up into Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, you'll find meadow fescue there growing in pastures. Alfalfa, of course, that one's known as the queen of forages. Alfalfa is can be a long-lived perennial. Out here in the West, just about every hayfield that is being used for dairy production is going to be will have alfalfa in it. Either an alfalfa grass component or a pure alfalfa stand. One of the lesser known legumes that is also perennial is a plant like bird's foot trefoil. And the interesting thing about bird's foot trefoil, and I always wonder whether to pronounce it trefoil or trefoil, is that it actually contains a high amount of tannins in it. And tannins are a biochemical compound that actually makes it so that the protein isn't so as rapidly digestible, and those tannins help to reduce the incidence of bloat. So generally, animals grazing, they can graze a pure stand of bird's foot trefoil, and there's no issues with bloat. Which contrasts that with alfalfa. If animals are grazing alfalfa and they are not accustomed or have not been properly prepared to graze alfalfa, alfalfa has a very high saponin content in it, and therefore it's the incidence of bloat is very, very high. But there are some producers that have actually been able to, over a period of about anywhere from a half a week to a week, to be able to get their animals properly set up to be able to graze pure alfalfa stands. So there are producers out there that have done it, but that is something that only those that are very experienced and have a good strategy in place can do so safely without bloating animals. Now we're going to get into, the seasonality of plants, and this is broadly categorized between cool season and warm season. So cool season plants, like you see the wheat on the right, they generally grow best when it's between 65 and 75 degrees. So that's when they reach peak photosynthesis, when the plant is capturing solar energy, and then it's taking water and carbon dioxide, and then it is then creating plant sugars from that. So that 65 to 75 degree range is optimal for them. And because of that, they are generally more adapted to northern latitudes and shorter growing seasons. That being said, even as far south as northern parts of Mississippi and Alabama will have cool season plants. So you take like tall fescue, for instance. Tall fescue is a cool season plant that can actually handle growing in a hotter environment. But then, we have plants up here in Idaho that absolutely, if I take like Idaho fescue, for instance, that absolutely will not grow in the conditions of northern Mississippi or northern Alabama. So it has a much lower tolerance of that high heat and humidity. And of course, it's much more reliant on drier conditions compared to what tall fescue is. So some examples of cool season plants would include wheat, oat, your annual ryegrass, tall fescue, orchard grass, and meadow fescue. Now we're going to contrast this with a warm season plant. Warm season plants have a different photosynthetic pathway. And that photosynthetic pathway is dependent on what the temperature is. So when you get into areas where you're between 75 and 90 degrees, that's where warm season plants are absolutely the happiest. So you take corn, for instance. Corn is a warm season grass. When it's between 75 and 90 degrees, that corn is growing at the maximum rate. It loves the heat. Eastern gamagrass, as you see here on the right, it also loves the heat. So these plants that are warm season, they're really the most adapted to your southern latitudes. So you get into the southern half of the US where you get into temperatures that are in that 75 to 90 degree range, and they stay up there in that 75 to 90 degree range for 3 months, 4 months at a time. That's where you're going to see a lot of these, we're going to see warm season plants predominate. So some examples of these plants, I already mentioned corn and eastern gamagrass, but Bermuda grass, bahia grass, You know, those are subtropical grasses that thrive in a very warm environment because they came from a very warm environment. You know, your big blue stem, your Indian grass, your switchgrass, again, these are all plants that love the heat. But along with loving that heat is they have to be able to get moisture from their environment, because the hotter things get, the more moisture that's going to be needed. So as we're looking at these different plant classifications, one thing that's important to note is that there's a broad classification between grasses and broadleaves. So grasses, you know, it's easy to spot a grass by its leaf architecture. So the leaf is usually, you know, very narrow. Usually it's considerably longer than it is wide. Grasses are generally what we call mycorrhizal friendly. So mycorrhizal fungi, which if you haven't heard of that, you might want to look that up on the internet sometime. Mycorrhizal fungi is a type of a fungi that develops a relationship with the plant roots and actually increases the surface area of the plant root. And then that makes the plant more drought tolerant. It is able to procure minerals a lot easier than just if you don't have that mycorrhizal fungi association. And pretty much all of our grasses are very mycorrhizal friendly. So they will develop that relationship with that fungi. Our broadleaf plants can be categorized really into, you know, either a legume or a forage. I'd probably also add a third category here of brassicas. So I'll start off with the legume first. So your legumes like alfalfa, all your clovers, you know, your bird's foot trefoil, your sainfoin, these types of plants have a specific type of bacteria, and you can see that here on the right in this picture. Those little round growths on those roots that kind of look like blisters, if you will, on this alfalfa root. That's actually a bacteria that invades the plant root, and that bacteria can actually take atmospheric nitrogen. So the air that we're breathing, 78% of what we're breathing is nitrogen gas. So they can actually convert nitrogen gas into nitrate. And then that nitrate then becomes plant available, so that the plant can then use that nitrogen for photosynthesis. So our legumes have that association with rhizobia bacteria. Now it's important to realize that if you're going to be planting legumes of any kind in a pasture, that you'll want to make sure that you inoculate those legumes, because there's specific types of rhizobia bacteria that go with certain legumes. So the rhizobia bacteria you can't just say, well, it's in the soil. Yeah, it might be, but you're taking a big chance. So there's a rhizobia bacteria for alfalfa. There's a different rhizobia bacteria for bird's foot trefoil. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're ever looking at planting those, that you want to make sure that you get the right inoculant to blend with the seed, so that when you plant the seed for that legume, that the right rhizobia bacteria is going along with it, and it can start colonizing that root when that plant starts to germinate. So forages don't have that rhizobia bacteria relationship, but they are mycorrhizal friendly. And then when we get into brassicas, and we see the brassicas a lot more when we get into annual plants. So when you're looking at like plants like forage brassica or collard greens, stuff like that, some of those plants are used in a cover crop mix. Interesting thing about those plants, the brassica species, is they do not, for the most part, they don't really develop a relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. So they're kind of mycorrhizal independent. So as we're looking at plant growth forms, and especially for grasses will grow in basically two distinct forms. So they'll either grow as a bunch, And the way you look at that is you just follow the plant all the way down to the base. And if you can pick out a distinct clump of that grass, then generally it's going to be a bunch grass. Bunch grasses, for the most part, usually have a deeper root system. Their growing point is usually higher on the stem. And because of that, bunch grasses in a lot of cases, and native grasses would be no exception to this, is that they're usually less tolerant of continuous grazing. So if you went to the expense to put in like big blue stem or eastern gamma grass or side oaks grama or Indian grass or switchgrass, some of these native warm season bunch grasses, if the grazing management is not attuned to properly utilize those forages and go lighter on the grazing and not allow animals to camp in that area and graze it all the way down, then you'll have a chance of continuing that forage stand. But if the grazing management is just going to be continuous grazing, then there's really no need planting some of these native warm season grasses in there, because it'll just be a matter of a few years and eventually they'll be grazed out. So some examples of the bunch grasses would be plants like your tall fescue, which we have tall fescue up here in under irrigated conditions. And then also big blue stem, as you see on the picture on the right. So when we look at sod forming grasses really don't have any distinct clumps. So when you're parting back the vegetation and you're looking at it, you can't see any distinct clumps. It's basically, in a thick sod. And generally speaking, sod forming grasses usually don't develop as deep of a root system or as an extensive as a root system. That's a generality. There's always exceptions. And the thing about sod forming grasses, though, is that their growing point is low on the stem. So because the growing point is low, that means animals can come through and more severely graze the plant without damaging it, without damaging future growth. So that's kind of an advantage to those types of grasses. So where you're going to see Bermuda and bahia grass, for example, you're going to see those under, it can very easily see those under a system that's being continuously grazed, where the animals are staying in there for months at a time, and they keep coming back every few days and keep nipping off any little bit of regrowth that's occurred. Kentucky bluegrass, which is used a lot in lawns up here where I'm at, is another sod forming grass. And in our horse pastures up here, you may have started out with a really nice blend of orchard grass and meadow brome and maybe some clovers in there, but eventually the ends up resulting in Kentucky bluegrass, because that's one of the plants that we have up here that can withstand continuous grazing on it, because the growing points on Kentucky bluegrass, like Bermuda and bahia grass, are set very low. Whereas, your more productive forage grasses, your native warm season grasses up here, our orchard grass, our meadow brome, they carry their growing points up higher, and therefore they're more easily damaged from continuous grazing. So now a little bit of word here on native and introduced plant species. A lot of times the question comes up, which is best, native plants or introduced plants. And the thing about it is that it's really hard to answer that question, because it really depends on what you're coming from, the environment that you're in, what's most well adapted to your environment, and how you plan to manage it with livestock. But when it comes to creating something that is going to be a lot more resilient far into the future, that's where native plants, I think, really play an important role. So the thing about with natives is that they are absolutely the perfectly adapted plants to whatever your local soil and climate conditions are, because that's what was there. Either it's still there or it was there before the introduced species came along. And one of the things about native plants is they require few external inputs, because you think about it, you know, if you're in the deep South and you had native warm season plants there, like Eastern gamma grass or side oats grandma or big blue stem, you know, these plants survive for eons of time, and they withstood grazing from bison coming through. So they periodically get fertilized by the herbivores that came through to prune them, but then they were allowed to recover. And then it would be, you know, sometime later until those plants were recovered that the herbivores would come back and regraze them. So, you know, while the bison were out there, there was no one fertilizing these plants other than the fertility that, as the bison were eating, what was coming out the back end of the animals. So they, you know, these are the kind of plants that don't need to be propped up with any kind of synthetic fertility. Now, as such, because they are natives, they're less aggressive, you know, they're not going to be invasive, so they generally don't spread into areas where you don't want them to go. But they, on the flip side is under continuous grazing, they're absolutely intolerant of that. So if you're going to have native plants, and especially like some of these native warm season tall grass plants that we've been talking about, the grazing management really has to be top notch in order to keep those plants there. Otherwise, if continuous grazing is the management of the day, they will get grazed out, and eventually other plants like the bahia grass and the bermuda grass, if they're in close proximity, will eventually invade. Now, the other thing too is that these plants generally, you know, if you're looking to use them for stockpiling for winter grazing, generally they don't hold their quality as well, but there are exceptions to this depending on your location. I can think up in my environment, if there's any of you that are watching this that are from the Intermountain West, you know, we have a plant called basin wild rye, and it's a native cool season bunch grass. And it actually has very good forage quality during the winter. So it can actually be stockpiled very well. And where, you know, a field full of that and a mixture with other species to go along with it would provide some excellent winter forage grazing to really, really reduce the amount of hay that would be needed. So when we look at introduced plants, these ones are not as perfectly adapted to our local soils and climate as the natives are, but they are very aggressive. And not only are they aggressive, but if we're going to really try to get a large amount of production out of them, then usually, you know, we're looking at quite a bit of inputs going into it to keep them productive. Now, the flip side is they can tolerate usually continuous grazing. Especially if it's a sod-forming grass. Now, we do have a lot of introduced grasses that have their growing points up higher. So those ones can't, you know, they can't tolerate continuous grazing. You know, we have to have a very good system in place where the animals are moving at the rate in which forages are regrowing. But a lot of our sod-forming introduced grasses, they can tolerate the continuous grazing a lot better than other plants. Now, one of the advantages here with the introduced species is that they can produce a higher quality of forage for stockpiling for winter grazing. So, for example, your Bermuda grass, your bahia grass can actually stockpile pretty decently. And there's been studies showing that, you know, if you're looking at trying to maintain cows through the winter, that those grasses can be a real help in being able to carry animals on stockpiled forage without having to feed as much hay through the winter. So then this kind of begs the question, you know, why use native plants? If you open up just about any seed catalog, most of the seeds that you're going to see are going to be introduced plants. Probably 95% of them. Native plants, there's usually far fewer to select from, and then the seed costs are usually pretty high. Because since there is so little of it being grown and actually harvested for seed, the seed cost tends to be fairly expensive. But in native plants defense, when we start looking at trying to create a more resilient pastoral landscape, it's my belief that that one of the best pathways to creating a more resilient pastoral landscape is the inclusion of native plants, because that's going to help to increase the resiliency of that pasture ecosystem. And especially, when we're looking at, the incidence of droughts, where we're going, very long periods of time without any precipitation, you realize that, these native plants, they've been here for forever. And so they are the most well adapted. So when we're looking at trying to create a resilient pastoral landscape, I think the conversation would be remiss if we did not address the benefits that native plants can provide. The other thing too is that these plants really require, very few external inputs, and I mentioned that previously. These plants are adapted to our soils, so they have been able to thrive in the soil conditions that we have. You've also get improved wildlife habitat, usually with these native plants, as well as enhanced soil health, improved aesthetics, even higher quality forage. And that higher quality forage can come especially at a key point in time, like let's say, in midsummer, when it's really, really hot. A lot of these native warm season plants have a root system that goes down very deep. They can continue to be green and growing when it is hot, when maybe the bahia grass, the bermuda grass is starting to shut down. So that's going to help, provide a higher quality forage. Anytime animals can be eating a green blade of grass rather than a brown blade of grass, that's going to be better nutrition for them, as well as extending the grazing season. And when I talk about extending the grazing season using native plants, that is where, if let's say, for instance, if I was in the deep south, I was on the coastal plain, and bahia and bermuda grass are my main forages that I'm working with, then if we were to establish a native warm season grass pasture separately, in a separate area, and what we could do is livestock could be rotated onto the native warm season grasses during the peak production months of May through July, and then rotated back onto the bahia and the bermuda grass pastures for late summer, fall, and winter. And since those native warm season grasses are generally more drought tolerant, they're the most drought tolerant forages that we would have in that environment, this is going to benefit the grazier, given the opportunity. But they're going to need to lightly graze those native warm season plants. So we're going to have sufficient area when the animals are grazing through their paddocks, that the animals are not coming back on those native warm season grasses on the second go around too soon. Because you have to remember that when we're talking about some of these native warm season plants, as well as some of our native cool season plants, like up here in the north, is that they carry their growing points higher. And with that higher growing point means that if that growing point gets removed, then basically you are shutting production down for the remainder of the year, and that plant stays stunted. It may continue starting to grow from the base, but it's not going to be able to provide you the forage that you're going to need for the rest of that summer. So this is where, if we have bahia or bermuda grass as part of the mainstay of the forage of the operation, the native warm season grass can really add a nice kind of, if you will, kind of a pressure relief valve for those really hot summer periods. The other thing too is, let's say for instance, you've got tall fescue, and that's your dominant perennial forage. Then really, tall fescue is going to be grazed in spring, so that's going to be your window of opportunity there, and also it's going to be grazed moderately in the fall. So you could use a native warm season grass during the summer, but again, what you're going to need to do with that native warm season grass is you're going to need to have enough acres of it so that you can leapfrog between grazing the tall fescue in the spring and coming back on it in the fall. So you're going to have enough acres of the native warm season grass that, again, animals are not coming back in a second or third go around on those plants and then regrazing them, and then grazing them too low. And then you find out, if this happens over several years, then eventually the native warm season grasses start leaving. So the native warm season grasses definitely take more care and more attention if you're going to keep them. And with the price of seed, it's definitely an investment that you want to keep producing for a long time. So as we've been talking about, these forages that are growing up directly from the soil surface, whether we're talking grasses, forbs, legumes, brassicas, annuals, perennials, the question then comes into the context of the inclusion of trees, whether we have a pasture, whether we have farmland that's got maybe a forested or wooded area as part of it, or whether we've got open pasture. The question then becomes is there an advantage to utilizing trees in a pastoral landscape? And the answer is a resounding yes. There are distinct advantages. The number one advantage that I can say really is increasing the resilience of your pastoral landscape. And we'll get into how trees do that. The other thing that trees can provide, and of course, all these are perennial, thank goodness, is that they can improve the use of underutilized areas for grazing. So if you've got some wooded areas, some forested areas, and you may walk in there and there's really not much of anything growing in the understory, it may be just a bunch of leaves that are there from the trees. There would depend on how many acres you have of that, and the cost that would take to thin some of those areas out and get some reseeding going on in there. That could provide quite a bit more forage for you. The other thing too is improving pasture health. We'll get into that in just a moment. Improving livestock nutrition, comfort, and performance. This kind of gets at the effect of shade from trees, and we all know that on a 100-degree day, we'd much rather be under the dappled shade of a tree than out in the open. And another benefit along with that is additional forage can be provided, because some of these trees and the ones that I will be talking about actually produce fodder. So either the animals are eating the leaves that drop from the trees, or the crop that's being dropped from the trees. And then finally, trees can actually improve profitability. And that profitability doesn't come instantaneously, because trees are an investment. They don't grow overnight. I wish they grew as fast as corn, but they don't. And because of the longer time that it takes to get to a tree that's producing something, means that we really have to look hard at the economics to see if the upfront cost is worth it. And if we're planning on owning the land for decades, or our posterity is planning on taking over the operation, then definitely trees need to have some consideration. So some trees that kind of hit high on my radar list, and these are trees that are providing additional forage for livestock. So I'm speaking of this strictly from a livestock perspective. Probably the number one tree that we could look at would be a tree called honey locust. And you can see these big, beautiful pods that are developed on that tree. Those pods, with the right genetics, can contain up to 30%, 37% sugar. That is really, really, really high. That's right up there with corn and oats. So very high sugar production. Those pods actually drop from November through January. So this makes it for a tree that is really well adapted if you need winter forage. If you need more energy to add to your current stockpile of grass, these trees are made to do that. So if we use grafted stock in about 5 or so years time frame, one tree can produce 65 pounds of pods. The pods have a nutritional value of, like I was saying, corn and oats, which makes it an excellent source of winter forage. When your base forages, whether you've got bahia grass or bermuda grass or tall fescue or whatever grass you have in the understory, when those are dormant, this is like manna from heaven. Coming down at a time when your base forages are at their lowest nutritional quality. So as when you look at these honey locust leaves, look at how small those leaves are. We're not talking about the large leaf on a maple tree. These leaves are really, really small. And because of that, it produces a nice dappled canopy that lets light through forages growing underneath. So you never get this completely shaded out effect, because that's one thing that a lot of times people are concerned about is, how much shade is going to be produced? Is that shade going to retard the growth on my forages growing underneath? And so honey locust is a great example of a tree that doesn't do that. So it allows some light to come through, and then that light rotates around throughout the day. And then the tree that you see on your right is the American persimmon, and that is also another high energy feed supplement. And it does have varieties that drop fruit as early as August and as late as February, depending on your environment. And one of the neat things about that is it's dropping fruit for several months. So that fruit can also last well into the winter, depending on your environment. Black locust here, it grows very quickly. It fixes nitrogen. So that's going to benefit some of your understory grasses and forbs. It also produces a nice dappled canopy, as you see from that leaf structure. Those leaves are really, really small, not a huge leaf like a maple leaf is. And those leaves actually provide a high protein supplement. Beekeepers really like these trees because the bees just really flock to the flowers on this tree. And so beekeepers really like it because it produces a lot of honey. So there's with a tree that can continue to get larger in size, eventually you're going to get more and more bees that are pulling nectar off of those flowers to create more honey. The tree on the right is a hybrid poplar, and that's a very fast growing tree. It can grow to 8 feet in a single season. These are really best used where you need quick shade. So if you need a fast growing tree that's going to be able to provide some decent shade, then the hybrid poplar is one to look at. They can be pollarded. So when you say the term pollarded, that means cut above the browse height to provide fodder during summer months. So they can actually be pruned to provide additional forage during the summer months. Mulberries, they produce a really ripe fruit all summer long. The fruit can be readily utilized by poultry and hogs. And they're a great edible fruit for the rest of us too. That goes without saying. The leaves on mulberries are actually highly palatable and digestible. The protein content in the leaves with a good essential amino acid profile will vary anywhere from 15 to 28%, depending on the variety. And the mineral content is high, and there's no anti-nutritional factors or toxic compounds that have been identified on mulberries. So mulberry is good to go, whether you're talking the fruit or the leaf matter itself. The Austree hybrid willow on the right, that develops really fast shade, and that's a good one if you've got poorly drained areas. If you've got a high water table someplace, willow will do very well where you've got, really wet soil conditions. So the trees can be cut down to a foot from the ground every year, allowing them to resprout. That can then be browsed by livestock, or you can cut them above the browse height and chop the young branches off for your livestock during the summer slump. So you can use that one a couple different ways. You can also plant a few rows of these trees to drastically reduce wind speeds during the growing season and slow winds down during the winter. So as we've been going through this, and I really think it can't be overemphasized, is that this is a quotation from a paleoclimatologist at Montana State University, is that it's looking like what we've been experiencing with our climate is going to start to become more of the norm instead of the exception. Whether we're talking droughts, whether we're talking grasshoppers, whether we're talking flooding, essentially it seems that we are entering into a time where the weather patterns are becoming more severe. Our drier times are becoming drier. Our wet areas are getting wetter. And so we need buffers with all this. And this is part of the reason why the diversity of forages and trees, like what we've been talking about, can really help provide that buffer. So trees can really help a pasture be more resilient. And so what I have here is just a very simple figure with time on the horizontal axis and pasture health on the vertical axis. And if we have the proper tree canopy in place, whether we're talking about an existing woodland that's been thinned out to become silvo pasture, or whether we're talking about planting trees into an open pasture, that tree canopy can actually help that pasture to be more resilient. So if we have a catastrophic event like you see with that vertical line that's dashed, that whether that's a drought, whether that's a flood, whether that's really high temperatures, whether that's a really torrential rain event, that tree canopy can actually buffer a lot of that catastrophic event. So much so that you see how it dips down in pasture health a little bit, but then it bounces back up. It's very resilient, and that is, resilient means being able to withstand or recover quickly from a difficult condition. Now, if we contrast that with pastures in a low state of health, like this one represented on the red line, it's not very resilient, because it decreases in health very suddenly and significantly, and then it takes a very long time to recover. The difference in time it takes for the prior pasture, which had that tree canopy on it, and this pasture, which is completely open, to recover following a catastrophic event, really illustrates the concept of resiliency. So can trees enhance pasture resiliency? There's at least 3 ways that I can think of. First of all is the shade effect. That shade effect comes from the standpoint that generally when you are underneath the shade of a tree, you can see up to a 20-degree drop in temperature in certain instances. The cool season plants that are growing in the understory, if you have cool season plants in the understory, they can continue growing longer since they require a temperature for optimal photosynthesis between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. It also allows the plants to continue feeding soil life because the plants are not going dormant as quickly. There's greater nutrient cycling, enhanced soil aggregation, which is going to help with your water infiltration as well as creating more plant available water. It also reduces plant water loss and it preserves soil moisture. Secondly is the protection from intense rain events. And that's because that tree canopy is intercepting those raindrops so that the full force of those raindrops is not hitting the pasture, and especially if there happens to be any bare soil that you don't want it hitting in bare ground. So that tree canopy is going to help to intercept those raindrops and reduce their velocity so that when they do land on the pasture surface, they're landing at a much lower velocity. And that's going to help with, making sure that water is slowly going into the soil surface, not rushing and pounding on it. And then you end up having runoff as a result when the amount of rain coming down is exceeding the rate at which soil can soak it up. Thirdly is increased plant available water. And this is a big one because, if we can get more water to slowly soak into the soil, then that means plant available water can increase, right? And water is necessary for just about every chemical reaction in the plant, not the least of which is photosynthesis. Because photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide and water and sunlight and some minerals to help catalyze that reaction in order for plant sugars to be made. So more water in the soil up to a point means that photosynthesis and carbohydrates can continue being produced. And if air temperatures rise above 75 degrees, if we've got a cool season-based pasture in the understory, that draws on soil water to cool the plant down through a process called transpiration. So plants use water to actually cool themselves. So they'll pull water up from the soil and pump it against gravity and let it out through their leaves as a way to keep themselves cool. And so through transpiration, that water is basically kind of like, the coolant in your engine to keep the engine at a stable temperature. So trees, absolutely help with each and every one of these. So when we look at this resiliency, trees in this instance are kind of like the suspension system on a car, truck, or even some advanced tractors. The suspension system absorbs the shock from the bumps or potholes in the road to keep all the tires in constant contact with the road so control can be contained. Because once your tires lose contact with the road, you're out of control. For those of you who've ever driven a tractor at maximum speed, you know that hitting a bump or a pothole at 20 plus miles per hour could cause you to lose control. And with no suspension system, the tractor isn't resilient to the bump or the pothole, and you can end up on your side like this guy did. All I can say is thank goodness for a cab. But if the tractor has a suspension system on it, that same bump or pothole at the same speed makes the tractor very resilient. So in like manner, trees with their shade effect allow the pasture to be more resilient in the face of a catastrophic event by reducing the effects of high heat and drought compared to pastures that really have very few or no trees in them. So think about your farm for a second. Do you have areas occupied in shrubs and trees that aren't being grazed, but you're paying for? Here we have a farm that's a total of 82.4 acres. And under conventional management, where the area in shrubs and trees aren't managed as pasture, only 60.6 acres or 74% of the farm is being grazed. So this is really kind of a tragedy because the grazier, the landowner, is paying for those 21.8 acres that they're not getting any use out of. That payment's coming through either land payment, but if a grazier considers managing the shrubs and trees as additional pasture by doing some selectable thinning and seeding to grow more forage underneath that tree canopy, then that grazable acreage increases from 60.6 to 82.4, which is a 36. So that when we're using existing wooded areas for pasture, you'll want to consult individuals who are knowledgeable about the shrubs and plants in your environment. The main reason for this is to avoid placing animals where there could be toxic plants. For example, in the northeast of the US, a wooded area may have black cherry, which is a species that is toxic to livestock when the leaves are wilted. So tapping into the knowledge base of your local specialists could help to avoid placing animals in the wrong place at the wrong time. So 2 important notes when converting existing woodland into silver pasture is it's important to, like I just said previously, you want to make sure that you consult specialists in your local area to identify if there are any toxic plants. And even more importantly, when they're toxic, because not all plants that are toxic have the same level of toxicity all throughout the year. That toxicity oftentimes follows kind of a, it's higher at some points of the year and it's lower at other points of the year. And so it's important to realize that, just because there may be a toxic plant there doesn't mean that you can't utilize it. It just may mean that you have to have the timing of such when you bring animals in so that animals are in the right place at the right time when the toxicity is not an issue. The other thing too is we want to avoid damaging the trees and the soil because a little bit of damage, if the animals girdle the tree at all, or if you had hogs in there and the hogs were rooting around the roots of the tree, that could, at the very least, it could really slow down tree growth in coming years, and it could actually in some cases kill the tree. So caring for the trees and the soil is part and parcel with having animals either in a wooded area that you've opened up to turn into silvopasture, or if you've gone to the expense of planting trees out of open pasture. So what we want to do here is realizing that to improve as is with pasture health, that given a catastrophic event, and it seems like that's more and more of what we're living in these times, that the higher the health that pasture can be, and trees can be a part of improving that pasture health, again, resilient that pasture can be given whatever nature ends up dishing out at us. So another advantage of including trees as part of the system is increased forage production. And I'm just going to kind of go through this fairly quickly here, but if we have an open pasture, if you figure that there's 60.6 acres out there and you're producing 6,000 pounds per acre and about half of it is getting consumed, you're really looking at, over that period of time that those animals are there, which in this case would be 240 days, as you see down below, you can sustain about 25 animals over the course of about 8 months. But if we decide to actually integrate trees into the open pasture, we can actually add animal days of forage. And one animal day is 30 pounds of forage, which is what a 1,000-pound animal would require. But we can actually add animal days to the pasture either by adding those wooded areas as acreage, so that 21.8 acres, if we add that to the 60.6, we can actually, by the time you do all the calculations here, you can actually go from animals being on pasture for 240 days and actually increase it to 257 days. So that's 17 more days that animals can continue grazing, which increases your time on pasture by about 7%, but it decreases the time on hay by an equal 7%. If we look at adding trees into an open pasture, and here what I did is I took those 60.6 acres and I just did 1/4 of it, just to give you kind of an idea. But adding just 15 acres of honey locust trees, for example, can actually take my grazing from 240 days and notch it up to 278 days. So I can get an additional 28 days, an additional 38 days on pasture by including those 15 acres of honey locusts. So that's a 15, almost 60% increase on pasture and an equal amount decrease on days on hay. Kind of wrapping up here, but with trees in the landscape, we're looking at a 20 to 30% higher crude protein content for forages that are underneath the shade versus forages being grown out, exposed to the sun all throughout the day. You've got the reduced heat load on the animals by up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And that can actually translate into pounds per day of gain. So University of Kentucky study looked at the effect of shade on animal performance. And they found with steers that can actually mean a difference of almost 9/10 of a pound per day. Well, if you're in an area where you have, like, let's say 90 days where you're over 80 degrees. Ruminant animals, especially cattle, for instance, they hit their thermoneutral maximum at 77 degrees. So when they're into the 80-degree range, they can be taking heat stress, which if they're under heat stress, then that means they're not going to be eating as much, which also means they're not going to be gaining as much. So if you look at, if you're in an area that you're hitting over 80 degrees for more than 3 months, that 0.89 pounds per day could translate into an 80-pound difference by the end of the 90 days. So that's definitely something there to consider as far as the effect on animal performance. Let's see here. This is just a quick little spreadsheet that I made up, just kind of showing the economic impact of including trees into an open pasture. Now, this is just in its beta version. This is just in its infancy. This is not a final version of the spreadsheet by any means. But what I want to be able to illustrate here is oftentimes when we talk about including trees in open pastures, what's the payback? How much is it going to cost me up front? And then when am I going to see all that money return back to me in savings through hay? And here what we have is a 15-acre area that's been planted to trees, 36 trees per acre, and it costs $36 per tree to put in. The trees are putting out 65 pods by year 10, and you've got a tree mortality of 15%, and you're grazing it with 25 head. How is that going to impact my operation long term? So here in year 1, we see where the total cost of the trees was here up front at almost $20,000. But you look at this hay expense per year, and this expense keeps adding up, keeps getting larger every single year to just account for, that, hay doesn't stay always at the same price. It varies wildly. And I just used a 2% inflation increase for every year, but we all know that that isn't reality. Hay can be $200 a ton one year. It can go down to $150 the next year. It can go to $225 the year after that. So I just used a 2% increase just to make things easier to calculate. But basically I showed here, the yellow, any number that appears in yellow means that we haven't yet paid for the trees, but it goes green by the time you hit year 13. So, this shows that, trees are not going to provide an instant payback. It's an investment. And again, like I was saying, if you have plans to own the property for decades or to transition it to the next generation, then this is definitely something worth looking into. So some resources that you can go to for more information. I've got a few listed here. I'm sure you guys will all be able to get access to this video that we're doing since it's being recorded, so you can look at these resources in the future. But there's some really good books here about tree crops, silvopasture, planting tree crops, also others on how to utilize those trees, taking grazing to new heights. There's a really fantastic website here called treesforgrazers.com. And then there's another really good publication put out by the University of Minnesota on silvopasture. But here is where it all kind of comes down home for each and every one of you is reaching out to your local NRCS office or your county extension office. Oftentimes they will be the point of contact to put you into touch with specialists that specialize in either grazing management, forages, or also trees. The other thing too is your NRCS and your state extension grazing specialists and foresters. You can look them up on the internet very easily and get in touch with them so that you can get some more site-specific information regarding your property. I'm just speaking in generalities, and there's no way that we can get into specifics. You can't even do that on a state level, let alone a national level. Some other good resources are, getting familiar with the plants in your neck of the woods. Pun was definitely intended on that one. So that's where, oftentimes when I'm looking to see what plants grow in what area, then I will just get on the internet and I will look up, I'll search for, for example, grasses in Mississippi or, forbs in Kentucky. And usually I'm going to find something, that's going to dial me in as far as, getting a better handle on what plants I'm going to find in my area. So with that, my part of the presentation is done here. Felicia, do we want to open it up for any questions?
Yes, we do. So let me do this right quick. I want to make sure everyone can either unmute themselves. So I'm going to do that. Justin, I'm going to do the same for us, ask you to unmute. All righty. So now you have the capabilities of unmuting yourself and asking your question, but I'm going to start with our questions in the chat. If you could give me a moment to get those done. So first question is, for those in climates that can use both cool season and warm season forage, would you be using both within the same pasture, or should you have separate cool season and warm season pastures?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Well, the answer is pretty simple on that. You're going to want to keep them separated. And that's purely because if you've got cool seasons blended with warm seasons, the plants that are going to come up first in the spring are going to be your cool season plants. So they're going to get ahead of your warm seasons. And, the cool seasons will start growing, when soil temperatures are hitting 40 degrees. Those cool season plants are starting to wake up. Your warm seasons aren't starting to wake up really until the soil temperatures hit 55 or 60 degrees. So the advantage goes to the cool season. Now, it'd be wonderful if you could have them both be in the same pasture at the same time and keep a balance, but I don't know how you do that, just based on plant physiology and the temperature at which plants grow. So if I was in an area where I had the option of using native warm season grasses, forages, then I would want to establish a separate pasture for that I could manage separately, but I would still do a diverse mix of native warm season grasses. I wouldn't just use a monoculture. I would probably try to use a 5, 6, 7 way mix so that we've got diversity even there.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. Next question. How far north can we go with Eastern gamma grass?
Good question. I know it grows as far north as Kentucky, but I'd have to do more research to see if it has been found any further north, like into southern Ohio or Indiana. You're losing heat units as you're going further north. But I do know it does grow in Kentucky, in central Kentucky. But I could easily, or anyone else could research into that. If you go on the USDA plants database, now this was a resource that I did not mention. The USDA plants database, you can actually look up, put in the common name of a plant like gamma grass or Eastern gamma grass, and then it will show you a map of the US. It'll highlight the states where that plant has been found. So, if you did that with Eastern gamma grass, it'll highlight the entire southeast part of the country. It'll probably highlight Nebraska and Eastern Kansas, Eastern Oklahoma, and Eastern Texas. But when you start getting into Iowa, Illinois, stuff like that, that's where it'd be kind of interesting to see if that's been found there. But
all right, thank you. So we had just a comment about, when you were speaking on silvopasture, and this person said layered enterprises, such a smart use of the land, having layered enterprises.
yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's where if you were like, I mentioned some trees that could be used to be a supplement to livestock. Now you could plant things like oak for acorns. You could plant apple trees, a lot of other different types of fruit and nut bearing trees that would have either a human food value to them, or a timber value later on once the tree reaches maturity and you're looking at replacing the tree. Timber value is really looking a long, long ways down the road. But you get into stuff like hazelnuts, chestnuts. I know up in Wisconsin where I used to live, they were trying to really kind of get the hazelnut industry going. So there's definitely, food producing trees that can be integrated. One of the things people do with apple trees is you may be growing an environment that can't produce a good quality eating apple, but it can be used to make cider with. So that's where some people, they'll integrate apple trees in with this and then harvest the apples and turn them into cider. So, we can definitely, layer other enterprises within it to essentially, you're just stacking one enterprise on top of another, which can, really increase the profitability per acre of an operation beyond just livestock.
All right, next question. Is black locust toxic, the leaves or seeds?
The leaves of black locust are not toxic. Those are actually edible to livestock. I don't know about the seeds.
Okay. And then the next question is, how would you teach cattle to browse woody plants? Have some goats teach them? That's two questions in one.
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, animals are going to be seeking out, and especially younger animals are exploratory of their environment, and so animals will self-medicate. They will try things, especially younger stock. They're always looking around trying to figure out what this tastes like, what that tastes like. So really getting cattle to utilize, like, let's say willow. I live in an environment where willow predominates on the lowland areas that are either have a high water table. As far as I can tell, they didn't need any goats to teach them how to utilize willow, because boy, do they use it, and they use it hard. So animals by nature will be somewhat exploratory of their surroundings. And so when they come across something novel, all it takes is one animal out of a group of 20 or 30 to just start nibbling on it. Pretty soon all the other animals start taking notice, and then they start trying it out.
Thank you. And I also put a link in. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Kathy Voff, but she has this cows eat weeds and that notion, and as many universities have tapped into that notion, because most of us been told that they don't, but it's a management. And as Justin said, animals will explore if that's the only thing there. So it is a management. If you give them vast amount of forages to eat, they're going to go to the most succulent, the nicest, and so forth. But it's a management. So thank you, Justin, for that. But I put that link into the chat, as well as the USDA plant database that Justin just mentioned. That link is in the chat as well. All right, next, this is a comment, Justin. Our cattle seem to browse the tree leaves and young saplings or young branches on their own as long as they are available. Often before grass is ready, I will cut fresh young trees, and they love those. Later in the summer, they will enjoy the leaves and branches that are available.
Yeah.
And then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's great. I love to hear of other people's experiences, where they're using what we would call unconventional forages for animals.
Yes. Great. Now, I hope you can remember this. This question is asking you to repeat which type of specialist. Is this a local extension or a local district forester? So this is pertaining to a comment you made in your presentation.
Well, what I was saying is that if, you can go on the internet and you can look up like your county extension and talk to your extension agent, and then they usually have a state extension specialist for forestry, for livestock, for forages. It's those people that you want to eventually be able to get in contact with. So your county agent would be kind of the portal to be able to get in contact with those specialists if the county agent doesn't feel comfortable in providing the information that you're seeking. The other thing too is for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, every state office. So every state has a state office, and they have usually a state forester and a state grazing specialist on staff. And if you go to your local NRCS office, which is usually co-located with the Farm Service Agency office and Rural Development, so usually all three of those offices are like in the same place. If you go there and you talk to someone there at your local NRCS office, and you could definitely go in and they may have a grazing specialist there in that office that can help you. Tap on the shoulder of the state grazing specialist or the state forester for additional information so that you're able to get the resources, the information that you need to be able to make good decisions moving forward.
Great, thank you. Next question, what is a cheap and effective way to protect tree seedlings after planting?
Well, you can get tree guards. They're usually made out of, from what I can tell, plastic. But those tree guards go on immediately, when you plant the trees so that the animals aren't girdling them. So I think you can get those just about anywhere.
Yes, great. I think this would be our last question unless others would like to unmute themselves. What about using trees which provide a secondary income such as pecan, walnut, chestnut, etc.? You would improve the resilience of the pasture as well as gain a crop to sell in addition to livestock.
Yeah, that just follows along the question that we went over probably about 10 minutes ago, kind of asking about the stacking and layering of enterprises. So I mentioned chestnuts, hazelnuts, crops that can actually be used for human consumption. And this really, you and I were talking yesterday that, when you look in the grocery store, most everything you're looking at is coming from an annual plant. Very few are coming from a perennial source, besides, your fruits, your apples, your pears, your peaches, your nectarines, plums, stuff like that. Those are from a perennial source, but most of your vegetables for your green smoothie that you have every morning, that's coming from an annual plant. And so, the question of food security going into the future, I think is something that definitely needs more attention, that we probably need to be looking at ways that we can include perennials as a greater part of our diet rather than everything coming from.
Yes, that would just be another workshop, Justin, to
Yes,
move
that
into.
would be another workshop.
But, okay. Well, Justin, I think you have answered everything. That is so wonderful. We appreciate you joining us today, Justin, and of course, every other participant on here. But this was such a wealth of information. And yes, it will be other workshops because Justin and I had a great conversation on yesterday on what is needed in the future when it comes to livestock and really saving our books. When it comes to our livestock, that is an industry that could get very, very expensive. And we want to do what we can as ag specialists to come up with ideas and not ideas that are new. These are ideas that farmers have realized and are utilizing in their areas. And we just want to bring it to you. So we're grateful that you're here today and we thank you for joining us. Justin, I'll let you have the closing remark and we can close it out today. I
just want to say thank you everyone for joining, and I think my contact information will probably be made available, Felicia, if anyone has any future questions. I may not have the answer, but I'll certainly try to track down the person who knows the answer and get back in touch with you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you today. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.